Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive on Indian power. You sent us a ton of interesting stuff, reports, articles, even some personal notes. You've clearly been doing your homework on this one. I have to say, going through it all, I was blown away.
Yeah, it's a hot topic for sure.
For instance, did you know that just last June, India's peak power demand hit almost 250 gigawatts?
Wow.
It's hard to even imagine 250 million homes all running at the same time, but they did it.
That's incredible.
Clearly, India's power sector is a force to be reckoned with.
It really is. And what's even more impressive is their commitment to clean energy sources. They're aiming for a massive 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity by 2031. That's a game changer.
500 gigawatts, that's a huge number. To put things in perspective, India is already the world's third largest electricity producer and consumer.
That's right. And that tells us something important about their economy. It's growing fast. Power consumption jumped by 9.5% in fiscal year 2023, which is a clear sign of that growth.
And this isn't just about keeping the lights on. It's about powering industries and creating opportunities. Your notes mentioned the Nathpajakri hydroelectricity station, setting a monthly generation record. That's the kind of power we're talking about, massive, and it's fueling India's economic engine.
Absolutely. Now, when we talk about India's power, it's important to understand the mix of energy sources. Currently, thermal power, which is mainly from coal, still dominates. But here's the exciting part. Renewables are catching up
I
quickly.
was surprised to see how fast solar energy has been growing. It's grown 30-fold in just a few years. That's
It
incredible.
is, and it's not happening by chance. The government is actively promoting solar energy through initiatives like the Jawaharlal Nehru National Solar Mission, and they're attracting massive investments.
Yeah, I noticed that they've even opened up the sector to 100% foreign direct investment. That's a big statement.
They're definitely serious about attracting global capital, and they're not just focused on large-scale projects, they're also encouraging everyday people to embrace solar power with this really catchy scheme called PM Suryagar Muft Bijli Yojana.
TM Sudagar Muft Bijli Yojana.
Yeah, it basically translates to free electricity from your rooftop. They're making solar accessible and affordable, which is brilliant.
That's a great way to get people on board. But I'm curious, how exactly does this scheme work? And what kind of impact is it having on the ground?
Well, that's a great question. Let's dive into that and also take a look at the other financial incentives the government is using to drive this renewable revolution.
Okay, let's do that. But before we get too deep into renewables, I have to ask about coal. I mean, it's still a major part of their energy mix, right?
Yeah.
How are they handling that with all this focus on clean energy?
That's the million-dollar question. Phasing out coal is a huge challenge not just for India, but for the world. It's a balancing act between economic growth, environmental concerns, and the livelihoods of millions of people who depend on the coal industry. It's a complex issue.
Absolutely. So how are they approaching it?
Well, they're tackling it from multiple angles. They're investing heavily in renewable energy sources like solar and wind power. They're also working on improving the efficiency of existing coal-fired power plants to reduce emissions. They're promoting energy conservation measures and exploring cleaner coal technologies. It's a multi-pronged approach.
So it's a transition, not a sudden switch.
Exactly. It's a gradual process, but they're making progress.
And speaking of progress, you mentioned some really interesting government initiatives aimed at transforming the power sector, things like Ujala Sopagya and a push for smart grids. I have to admit, I'm not entirely familiar with all of these. Can you break it down for us?
Sure. Let's start with smart grids. Think of it like upgrading the nervous system of the entire power network. Instead of just pushing electricity blindly, smart grids use data and sensors to make the system more efficient, reliable, and adaptable to changing demands.
That sounds pretty high tech.
Yeah.
But how does it work in practice?
Yeah.
And what about these other schemes like Ujala and Sopagya? What's their role in this transformation?
UJLA is all about energy efficiency, particularly in lighting. They've been replacing traditional bulbs with LEDs, which saves a ton of energy. It may seem like a small change, but think about the cumulative effect across millions of households.
Right. Small changes can have a big impact.
Exactly. And then you have Saupagya, which aims to bring electricity to every single home in India. It's a massive undertaking, but it's making a real difference in people's lives.
It's amazing to think about the impact that must be having on those communities. It's not just about electricity, it's about access to opportunity.
Absolutely.
Right.
And to fund all these initiatives, they're pulling out all the stops. They're attracting billions of dollars in investments, both from within India and from international players.
So this renewable revolution isn't just about saving the planet, it's also a huge economic opportunity. It's starting to make sense why you called this topic electrifying. But with all these changes and investments, there must be some risks involved, right?
You're absolutely right. There are always risks and challenges when you're dealing with something as complex as the power sector. We need to consider the potential downsides, the challenges they're facing, and how those could impact the big picture.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and explore those challenges and risks. What are some of the things that could go wrong or slow down their progress?
Well, that's what we're going to be looking at next. There are a lot of moving parts here, and it's important to understand the whole picture before we get too carried away with all the positive developments.
Makes sense. So stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back after a quick break.
Welcome back to our deep dive into India's power sector.
So far, we've talked about the incredible growth, the shift towards renewables, and all those ambitious government initiatives. But I think it's important to step back for a minute and look at the historical context.
You're absolutely right. Understanding how India's power sector got to where it is today is crucial for understanding where it's going.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. What's the origin story of India's power sector?
Well, it's a pretty fascinating story, actually. It all started way back in the pre-independence era before 1948.
Pre-independence, wow, that's going way back.
Yeah, those were the early days when electricity was still a relatively new concept in India.
So how did it all begin?
Well, back then, the focus was mainly on setting up some basic infrastructure and getting things started.
So what happened next?
Well, in 1948, India gained independence, and that marked a turning point for the power sector. They passed the Electricity Supply Act, which kind of laid the groundwork for the development of the industry, and they also established those state electricity boards, or ESEBs.
SIBs. I've heard that term before. What are they exactly?
The ESEBs were basically responsible for generating and distributing electricity in their respective states. It was a pretty decentralized system back then.
So each state kind of did its own thing.
Exactly. But then came a big shift in the 1950s and 60s with the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956.
What was that all about?
Well, that's when the government decided to nationalize the power sector.
Nationalized, so they brought it all under for central control.
Yep. They saw power as a strategic asset essential for nation building.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess they wanted to make sure everyone had access to electricity and that it was being used to drive industrial growth.
Right, and this led to a period of rapid expansion in power infrastructure across the country.
Sounds like they were making some serious progress, but did it all go smoothly?
Well, like any major undertaking, there were challenges along the way.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest problems was that the SEBs weren't really financially sustainable. They were heavily subsidized, and that led to inefficiencies and losses.
So it was kind of a drain on the economy.
Yeah, and there were also infrastructure bottlenecks and issues with power theft and distribution losses. It was a complex situation.
So they had all this new infrastructure, but it wasn't really working as efficiently as it could.
Exactly. But then in the early 1990s, things started to change again.
Oh, what happened?
Well, in 1991, India went through a major economic liberalization.
I've heard about that. It was a big deal, right?
Yeah, it was a game changer. It opened up the Indian economy to private investment and competition.
So what did that mean for the power sector?
It meant that private companies could now invest in power generation and distribution, which brought in much-needed capital and expertise.
So it's kind of like a breath of fresh air for the industry?
Exactly. And then in 1998, they passed the Electricity Regulatory Commissions Act, which was another important milestone.
What did that do?
It established independent regulatory bodies to oversee the power sector and promote fair competition and rational pricing.
So it's all about creating a more level playing field and attracting more investment.
Exactly. And this set the stage for the growth era that we see today.
So this liberalization was really a turning point.
It was. It really transformed the Indian power sector and laid the foundation for the incredible growth we're seeing now.
And that brings us up to the present day with all those government schemes and initiatives that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has.
Yeah.
So we've got this historical backdrop now. Let's talk money. Because at the end of the day, it all comes down to financing, right? How is India funding this massive transformation in its power sector?
Well, the good news is that money is pouring into the sector. Both domestic and foreign investors are eager to get a piece of the action.
We saw those numbers, billions and billions of dollars. That's insane.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And a lot of it has to do with those relaxed FDI norms we talked about earlier. They've made it much easier for foreign companies to invest in India.
So they're rolling out the red carpet for global capital.
They are, and it's working. They've attracted some of the biggest names in the energy industry.
But it's not just about attracting investment. It's about using it wisely, right? So what are some of the key financial tools and mechanisms they're using to channel all this money into the right projects?
Well, one of the most important is the Power Purchase Agreement, or PPA.
PPA. What's
Yeah.
that?
It's basically a long-term contract between a power producer and a distribution company. The producer agrees to sell electricity at a predetermined price, and the distributor agrees to buy it. It provides certainty for both sides and makes it easier to secure financing.
So it's kind of like a safety net for investors.
Exactly. And then you have institutions like the Power Finance Corporation and the Rural Electrification Corporation. They play a crucial role in providing loans and financial assistance to power projects.
So they're kind of like the banks of the power sector.
Yep. They're specialized financial institutions that understand the unique needs of the industry.
And what about green bonds? They seem to be all the rage these days. Are they playing a role in India's power sector as well?
Absolutely. Green bonds are becoming increasingly popular as a way to finance renewable energy projects, and India is no exception. They've even started issuing sovereign green bonds, which is a big deal.
Sovereign green bonds, what are those?
They're basically bonds issued by the government specifically to finance environmentally friendly projects.
So it's a way for investors to put their money into projects that align with their values.
Exactly. And it's a win-win situation because it helps India achieve its renewable energy targets while also attracting investors who are looking for sustainable investment opportunities.
So it seems like they're really pulling out all the stops to finance this transition to a cleaner energy future.
They are, and it's paying off.
Speaking of clean energy, we can't ignore the environmental impact of all this, right?
Right.
I mean, India is still heavily reliant on coal, which is a major source of pollution.
You're absolutely right. Coal is still a big part of the equation, and it's something that we need to address head on.
So how are they dealing with that?
Well, as we discussed earlier, they're investing heavily in renewables like solar and wind power, but they're also taking steps to make their existing coal-fired power plants more efficient and cleaner. They're promoting energy conservation measures and exploring cleaner coal technologies.
Cleaner coal technologies? Is that even a thing?
Yeah, it's an area of active research and development. There are technologies that can capture and store carbon emissions from coal plants, which can significantly reduce their environmental impact.
So it's not just about ditching coal altogether. It's about finding ways to use it more responsibly.
Exactly. It's about finding a balance between economic growth, environmental sustainability, and energy security.
Right, because we can't just flip a switch and turn off all the coal plants overnight. People still need electricity, and industries need to keep running.
Exactly. It's a gradual transition. But the good news is that India is moving in the right direction.
And what about energy efficiency? That seems to be a big part of the solution, too.
Absolutely. Energy efficiency is crucial. It's all about squeezing more out of every watt of electricity we generate.
It's like getting more bang for your buck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there are so many ways to improve energy efficiency, from using LED bulbs and energy efficient appliances to designing buildings that are more energy efficient.
And the government is promoting energy efficiency through various schemes and initiatives, right?
The EJL scheme we talked about earlier is a great example. They've been replacing traditional incandescent bulbs with LEDs, which consume far less energy.
It seems like a small thing, but it can make a big difference when you multiply it across millions of households.
Absolutely. And it's not just about lighting. They're also promoting energy efficiency in industries, buildings, and transportation.
So it's a holistic approach.
It has to be. We need to tackle energy efficiency from all angles.
All right, so we've covered the financial and environmental aspects now. Let's talk about the social impact of all of this. Because at the end of the day, electricity is about people, right? It's about improving lives and creating opportunities.
You're absolutely right. Access to electricity can be transformative. It can empower communities, improve healthcare and education, and enhance the overall quality of life.
And India has made remarkable progress in electrifying the country, especially in rural areas.
They have schemes like Sapagya have brought electricity to millions of households that were previously living in darkness.
I can't even imagine what a difference that must make.
It's life-changing. It allows children to study at night, businesses to operate more efficiently, and families to enjoy a better standard of living.
It's amazing to think about the ripple effects of something as basic as electricity.
It is. And it's not just about access, it's also about affordability.
Right, because electricity needs to be affordable for people to truly benefit from it.
Exactly. And the government has implemented various policies and subsidies to ensure that electricity is affordable for low-income households.
So it's a delicate balancing act between ensuring affordability and keeping the power sector financially sustainable.
It is. But it's a balance that we need to strike.
Now, while all this progress is amazing, it's important to acknowledge that there are also social challenges associated with India's power sector.
Of course. Every story has two sides.
So what are some of the challenges they're facing?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is ensuring equitable distribution of electricity. While great strides have been made in expanding access disparities between urban and rural areas still persist.
So it's kind of like the digital divide, but with electricity.
Yeah, it's a similar concept. The cities tend to get the best infrastructure and the most reliable service, while rural areas often lag behind.
And what about the environmental impact of all this infrastructure development?
Yeah.
I mean, building all those power plants and transmission lines must have some impact on the environment.
You're right. Large-scale power projects like dams and thermal power plants can have significant environmental and social impacts.
So how are they mitigating those impacts?
Well, they're implementing environmental impact assessments and taking steps to minimize damage to ecosystems and biodiversity. They're also working with local communities to address their concerns and ensure that they benefit from these projects.
So it's about finding a balance between development and sustainability.
Exactly. And it's not always easy, but it's essential.
And what about the impact on jobs? I mean, the transition to renewable energy is going to create new jobs, but it's also going to displace workers in the traditional fossil fuel industry.
That's right. It's a complex issue, and we need to make sure that the transition is just and equitable. We need to provide retraining opportunities for workers who are affected and ensure that they're not left behind.
So it's not just about the technology and the economics, it's about people's lives.
Exactly.
All right, so we've talked about the past, the present, and the challenges. Now let's look to the future. What are some of the trends and innovations that are shaping the future of India's power sector?
Well, the future is looking bright. There are some really exciting developments on the horizon.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest trends is the rise of decentralized energy systems.
Decentralized, what does that mean?
It means generating electricity closer to where it's consumed rather than relying on those massive centralized power plants and transmission lines.
So it's like taking power back to the people.
Exactly. And a lot of this is being driven by the growth of renewable energy sources like solar and wind power, which are naturally more decentralized.
So instead of having these huge power plants pumping electricity across long distances, you have smaller scale generation happening right in the communities.
Exactly. And this has a lot of advantages. It reduces transmission losses, makes the grid more resilient, and gives communities more control over their energy supply.
So it's not just about clean energy, it's about energy democracy.
I like that energy democracy. It's a good way to put it.
And what about smart grids? We touched on that earlier, but I'd love to hear more about how they're going to transform the power sector.
Smart grids are going to be huge. They're going to revolutionize the way we manage and distribute electricity.
So how do they work?
Well, basically, they use sensors and data analytics to optimize the flow of electricity across the grid. They can detect and respond to changes in demand in real time, and they can even integrate renewable energy sources seamlessly.
So it's kind of like giving the power grid a brain.
Exactly. And this is going to be crucial for making the transition to a cleaner and more sustainable energy future.
And what about energy storage? I've heard that's going to be a game changer too.
Yeah, it is. Energy storage is going to be essential for managing the intermittency of renewable energy sources like solar and wind power.
Intermittency, what's that?
It means that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So we need a way to store the energy we generate when it's available and release it when we need it.
So it's like having a giant battery for the grid.
Exactly. And there are a lot of different energy storage technologies being developed right now, from batteries to pumped hydro to compressed air energy storage.
Wow, it sounds like the future of energy is going to be pretty high tech.
It is. There's a lot of innovation happening in this space, and it's really exciting to see.
So to wrap things up, it seems like India's power sector is on an incredible journey. It's come a long way from those early days of nationalization to this exciting new era of clean energy and technological innovation.
It has, and the journey is far from over. There are still challenges to overcome, but the future is looking bright.
It's inspiring to see a country like India leading the charge in the global energy transition.
It is. They're showing the world that it's possible to achieve rapid economic growth while also reducing carbon emissions and creating a more sustainable energy future.
Now, I know we've covered a lot of ground today, but there's one more piece of the puzzle that we need to explore, and that's the geopolitical implications of all of this.
You're right. India's energy choices have implications that go far beyond its borders.
So how does what's happening in India's power sector impact its relationships with other countries and its role on the global stage?
Well, that's a great question. And it's something that we're going to delve into in our next segment. So stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back after a quick break.
All right, we're back and ready to tackle the global implications of India's power sector. It's a big topic, but I'm ready to dive in.
Me too. It's fascinating to see how energy choices can shape a country's relationships with the rest of the world.
So let's start with the basics. How does what's happening in India's power sector influence its relationships with other countries?
Well, think about it. Every country needs energy to keep its economy running, and some countries have more of certain energy resources than others.
Right, so they need to trade and cooperate with each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that creates a web of interdependencies and alliances.
So it's not just about buying and selling energy, it's about building strategic partnerships.
Precisely. And India has been actively strengthening its energy ties with several countries.
Like who?
Well, for starters, they've been deepening their relationships with countries in the Middle East, which are major suppliers of oil and natural gas.
That makes sense. Those are still crucial resources for India.
They are, but here's where things get interesting. India's push for renewable energy is also opening up new avenues for collaboration.
Oh, how so?
Well, their ambitious renewable energy targets are attracting investments and partnerships with countries that are leading the charge in clean technologies.
So they're teaming up with the innovators.
Exactly. Countries like Germany, Japan, and Denmark are sharing their expertise and technology with India, and that's helping to accelerate the growth of the renewable energy sector.
So it's a win-win situation.
Absolutely. And this collaboration isn't just happening on a bilateral level. India is also actively participating in global energy forums like the International Energy Agency and the UN climate change conferences.
So they're having a seat at the table.
They are. And they're using that platform to share their experiences, learn from others, and advocate for policies that support a cleaner, more sustainable energy future.
So their energy choices are giving them a bigger voice on the global stage.
Absolutely. And their voice is becoming increasingly influential as they demonstrate that economic growth and sustainability can go hand in hand.
That's impressive. But let's face it, the world is a pretty unpredictable place right now. We've seen conflicts, trade wars, and all sorts of disruptions. How are these global events impacting India's power sector?
That's a really important question, and it brings us to the concept of energy security.
Energy security, what's that all about?
Well, it basically means having a reliable and stable supply of energy at affordable prices. It's about reducing your vulnerability to disruptions, whether those disruptions are caused by natural disasters, geopolitical events, or market fluctuations.
So recent events like the conflict in Europe have really highlighted the importance of energy security.
They have countries that are heavily reliant on energy imports from a single source or region have found themselves in a very precarious position.
So how is India navigating this complex geopolitical landscape? What are they doing to ensure their energy security in these uncertain times?
Well, they're taking a multi-pronged approach. First, they're diversifying their import sources so they're not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Smart move, spread the risk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And second, they're actively exploring new energy partnerships around the world.
So making new friends.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And perhaps most importantly, they're focusing on boosting domestic energy production, particularly in renewables.
So becoming more self-reliant.
Exactly. It's about reducing their dependence on external sources and building a more resilient energy system from within.
That sounds like a solid strategy, especially in a world where energy is becoming increasingly intertwined with geopolitics.
It is, and it's a strategy that's being adopted by many countries around the world.
Okay, so this all sounds very high level, but I'm wondering how it connects to the everyday lives of people both in India and globally.
Well, think about it. Fluctuations in global energy prices caused by things like conflicts or natural disasters directly impact the prices of goods and services that everyone relies on.
Right, everyone feels it when gas prices go up or when their grocery bill is higher.
Exactly. And on the flip side, the global push for renewable energy is creating new jobs and economic opportunities all over the world.
So it's not just about government policies and international agreements.
Mhm.
It's about individual choices and the actions we take in our daily lives.
Absolutely. As consumers, we have the power to choose energy-efficient products, reduce our energy consumption, and support policies that promote renewables.
So we're not just passive observers in this global energy game.
Yeah. Not at all. We can all play a role in shaping a cleaner, more sustainable, and more equitable energy future.
Well, I have to say this deep dive has been incredibly insightful. I've learned so much about India's power sector and its impact on the world.
It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you. And remember, this is just a starting point. There's so much more to discover.
That's true. And who knows, maybe we'll do a follow-up deep dive sometime to explore some of these specific areas in even more detail.
I'd love that.
Well, until then, thanks for joining us on this electrifying journey into the world of Indian power. It's a complex